Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome along to our Austar Realty Grey White webinar. And I'm very, very excited today for our guest speaker, Ashley Church. Now, Ashley has been described as a polarising personality, which I find fascinating, but I'm sure we're going to hear a lot from Ashley that might divide our listeners. But the idea here is to hear what Ashley's got to say about what's happening in the economy and in our real estate market. Before I introduce Ashley to you, though, I'd have to say his background is one that he can speak with a lot of authority. He's been a councillor, he's been a politician, he's been CEO of the Auckland Property Investors Association. And he's been used by ZB Radio, he's been used by 7 Sharp, and I think he still is, and the AM show as well. So he's seen as a very, very authoritative market commentator. And it's a real pleasure to invite you to today, Ashley. Well, I wanted to start asking you a bit about the economy. You know, we're in these amazing times, to say the least. And I said, you know, we're hearing from the Reserve Bank that they've got all these interest rate rises coming along. I see, you know, we've obviously got a lot of inflation to deal with at the moment. We've got wages going up. We've got supply chain costs rising. So there's a lot of pressure on all those sort of costs coming into our lives at the moment. Our cost of food is rising, fuel's rising, everything is rising at the moment, and we're looking at interest rate rises. I'm kind of curious to see what your thoughts are around this, because if we look at some of the other countries, take Australia for instance, they're sitting back and waiting. They're not increasing their interest rates at the moment. So what's your thoughts around that, Ashley?
Yeah, so firstly, thank you very much for the very flattering introduction, Lynn. That's very nice. Yeah, it's an interesting time, and it's worth, because we talk a lot about interest rates in the context of the property market, and obviously the fear at the moment is that the increases in the OCR, the progressive increases in the OCR that the Reserve Bank has indicated that it's going to make over the next couple of years will feed through inevitably into mortgage interest rates, and the result of that is that we will have obviously an impact on the property market. And that impact's real. And it's real because we know, if we go back over the last 30 or 40 years, that despite what you might be told by media about the various different causes of house price inflation, there's actually only one cause that we can put our finger on consistently and say that's the thing that's caused house prices to increase over that period of time. And that's the decline in interest rates that's taken place since the 80s. If you go back to the mid-80s, and I think Australia was the same when, we had interest rates up around 20-21%, mortgage interest rates up around 20-21%, and we had inflation incidentally of about the same level. And that's progressively come down. Those mortgage interest rates have progressively come down. That correlates pretty strongly with the increases in house prices over that same period of time. In fact, you can map a relatively consistent diagram that shows as one's gone down, the other one's gone up. And so as we've become more sophisticated and educated in our understanding of how the property market works, we can, with some degree of accuracy, make the statement that if interest rates go down, property prices go up. In theory, come back to your question, if interest rates go up, property prices stabilise or perhaps even come down. So that's where we are right now.
Yes.
Now, against that, it's just important to understand why the Reserve Bank's doing this. It's not doing it to impact on house prices. That's not their intention. The reason the Reserve Bank is looking at increasing the OCR and impacting on interest rates across the economy is because their mandate, the reason that they exist, is around keeping inflation within a band of 1 to 3%. And they've done that very effectively for about 30 years. In fact, almost since they were established in 1989 as an independent entity, they've been very, very good at controlling inflation, so much so that many other countries, including the Reserve Bank of Australia and the Bank of England, essentially copied that process and implemented the same changes to their own economies. What's happened over the last 12 or 18 months is that inflation has gone, not only exceeded that 3% barrier, but well exceeded it, and has gone much higher than all of the pundits expected and predicted. And the result of that is that the Reserve Bank now has to scramble to increase interest rates in order to keep inflation under control. Now, just for those of you viewers who don't understand what the relationship is between the two, the theory, it's borne out relatively accurately over the last 30 years, the theory is that if you increase interest rates, you dampen demand. If you dampen demand, inflation comes down. Conversely, when you're in a recessionary period in the economy, central banks like the Reserve Bank will drop interest rates for exactly the same reason. They want to stimulate demand, and by dropping interest rates, more people spend money, and that gets you out of a recession. So that's kind of where we find ourselves at the moment. It's not just about house prices, but it certainly potentially has some impact on them.
Actually, there's also some downside to increasing interest rates, aren't there? And obviously the dollar starts to rise, and that brings its own problems, I guess, for the economy. Do you want to talk a little bit about that? How you see the economy sort of playing out over 2022?
Yeah, so the rationale behind that is that if you increase interest rates, it makes depositing of funds in your nation more attractive than comparable countries, and so that causes an inflow of currency and or purchasing of New Zealand currency, if you want to put it that way. And the effect of that is to increase the value of our dollar. Interestingly, that relationship hasn't been quite as strong and as exact over the last 10 years than you might expect. So whereas that theory is sound, the actual relationship hasn't been as strong as one might expect. And that's possibly simply because our interest rates have been so low for such a long period of time that hasn't played into being the factor that you might otherwise have expected it to be. But nevertheless, if that were to happen, in other words, if interest rates go up and therefore the dollar increases in value, the problem for the country in that regard is it makes our exports more expensive. If our dollar goes up, it means that the cost of New Zealand goods is more expensive to those who purchase them. And that's obviously got some pretty severe implications potentially for our exporters and as a corollary of that for our entire economy. So the Reserve Bank won't want that dollar to go up or indeed to be up for any period of time, because obviously it wants to keep that export sector strong, and because of obviously the healthy impact that has on our GDP. So yeah, there are a whole range of things which as a country, Len, we really haven't had to worry about for quite some period of time. We've had more or less under a pretty strong control, which now shows signs of being out of control, and which the Reserve Bank has to scramble, as I said before, pretty quickly to try and get back into the box.
So what's the difference between what's happening in Australia with them sitting back and waiting because they've got very similar circumstances, haven't they?
Yeah, so the only answer I can give to that is I assume that their inflationary pressures aren't as great as ours, because if they were, my guess is that they would be acting in pretty much exactly the same way. If they were seeing strong inflationary pressures coming through, they would be acting in the way that we are. So I would guess that the fact that they haven't means that their inflation's within the band that's set by them by the government, and that therefore they haven't going to act in the same way. So this is an emergency measure by our Reserve Bank, and we need to understand that it's a reaction to something they neither predicted nor expected, but they've had to move very quickly to try and put back into the journey back into the bottom.
Sure. I should have mentioned at the beginning of the show too that you're open for questions. So if anyone's interested in asking Ashley a question, you can certainly open your mic and come on board, or you can put it in the chat box and we'll deliver it to Ashley as we progress through the webinar. Ashley, let's move how this influence or the interest rate rises is going to impact on the real estate market, as you said. We've got a lot of first home buyers that still haven't been able to get into the market yet. I'm sure they're feeling very nervous about the future. Not that they've had a lot of confidence for a while, but it must be even looking gloomier than ever for those people. What's your feeling about it?
Yeah, it's interesting. You said before I'm a polarizing character, and the view I'm about to express is one of those polarizing views. I don't think it's actually as serious as many of the commentators are currently making out at the moment. And the reason that I say that is I tend to look at the property market in the context of decades rather than just months or years. And so if I look at the affordability of mortgages at the moment, and this is going to surprise people, but it's true, it's actually cheaper to service a mortgage now than it was 30 years ago. And you might say, well, how could that happen? House prices have increased exponentially. How can it be cheaper as a proportion of household income to service a mortgage now than it was 30 years ago? And the reason for that is because what I talked about before, mortgage interest rates have dropped. They've dropped dramatically over the last 20 or 30 years. And the result of that is that even though house prices have increased, the relatively small increase in salaries and much larger reduction in interest rates means that a property bought in Auckland, for example, of the median house price back in the mid-80s cost around 52% of income to service. In other words, about 52% of your income would have been required to service the mortgage on that home. That figure, as recently as a year ago, was about 37%. But it actually dropped quite dramatically. So that's still a large chunk of change. That shouldn't be dismissed. But the point that I'm making is that we're not at the worst point we've ever been in history. That was actually quite some decades ago. So is it as serious as it was 30 years ago? No. Does that mean we should dismiss it and not worry about it? No, we obviously do need to be concerned about it because the overall economy has been improving over that period of time, and we shouldn't necessarily be going backward just for the sake of it. So having said all of that, if I look at the economy overall, if I look at the property market overall, we're in a very strange period at the moment. I buy into something, Len, called the property cycle, and it's a very broad, unsophisticated, blunt instrument that says in a very sort of a broad, holistic sense, property prices within any of New Zealand's property markets will broadly, I keep using that word broadly, will broadly double in value every 10 or 11 years. It's certainly true in the case of Auckland.
Actually, I have a question.
Yeah, sure.
Yes, sure. I'm sorry to interrupt you. Yeah, I have two questions actually. The first question is about the interest rates. Oh, I should introduce myself first. I'm a PhD student at the University of Auckland, and then my supervisor introduced me to join your webinar because I can learn much from here. I'm doing a research about the fractional house ownership in New Zealand. And so I have a question about the first one is the economic indicator about the interest rates recently. Yep. So as my understanding, you mentioned about the interest rates is not about controlling the price, but more about the stabilizing the housing market, and it's an effort from the Reserve Bank. However, the interest rates also attract the foreign investment as the cash flow is going to come in here. So does this mean our New Zealand markets start to want to attract the foreign cash flows into the domestic markets? This is the first question. The second question is that, about recently there's a trend, there's a crash in the China property markets. A lot of giant property groups are going, yes, even Grant and even some others, Fortune Land as well, and so on, also are facing bankrupt tendencies. And so do you think there's any impact on our New Zealand markets, even though it seems like a little bit far from our
so I'll take the first question first. Yep. I'll take the first question first, then we'll come back to your second. So your first question was the impact of foreign investment in New Zealand, and the answer to that is we currently have a foreign buyers ban on residential property investments. So while I don't doubt what you're saying with regard to probably the desire to invest in the market simply because it's so attractive at the moment, the reality is that the mechanism by which it's possible to do that is pretty limited. In fact, as I understand it at the moment, unless you're Australian or Singaporean, it's almost impossible to invest in New Zealand. And I know there are those who say, oh, people can do it through
but they still can buy the high value properties, right?
Yeah, they can buy high value, and they can also buy new. So
yes,
so the commercial. So you can construct, which arguably, although if we have time, I've got a counter view on that as well. But arguably there is a benefit to the economy in doing that. So if there were to be foreign investment into the New Zealand economy to purchase new dwellings or construct new dwellings, I don't think that most of us would say that's probably not a bad thing. So if the cost of that is some house price inflation and some benefit to those investors, then all power to them. With regard to the higher value stuff, it's such a rarefied market, and there are so few people who are actually investing at that level that I don't think it actually impacts on the vast majority of us. With regard to your second one about Evergrande, I actually wrote an article about this a little while back, and it was basically what I did was I had a look at so I looked at Evergrande in the context of what it could potentially do to the New Zealand economy, because there was all sorts of claims being made that it was going to be sort of China's equivalent of the GFC, in the same way that the American economy meltdown impacted on the world economy, that the collapse of Evergrande and other companies was going to have the same impact. So I went back and had a look at the GFC to see what actually happened in New Zealand as a result of the GFC. And interestingly, it actually had very little impact. It had impact on our economy in other ways, but in our housing economy, at its worst, Auckland house prices dropped by about 8.2%, and that was 8.2% off a high where they doubled over the previous decade. Stayed there for about 18 months and then took off again. And if you look at the previous global impacts to our economy, the share market crash, the Asian financial crisis, none of those had an impact on our property economy. So, you know, could it have an impact? Maybe. Is it likely to? If you, as I do, if you look at history and treat history as the barometer by which you judge what's likely to happen, probably not.
Okay. Yep. Thank you for your answer.
Good question, Zoe. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for your question. Actually, we're obviously seeing our clearance rate of auctions is coming down, like everyone else in the marketplace, and we're finding that the market seems to be leveling, if not plateauing. What's your thoughts around going forward into 2022 as far as prices go? Are you seeing something that gives you a thought around what might happen?
So that comes back to the question I was answering before I answered the other two, which is to say that I buy into the idea of 10-year cycles, 10 or 11-year cycles, and keeping in mind that New Zealand is not one market, it's many markets, but in a simplistic sense, there's the Auckland market, and then there's the regional markets, and I'm going to oversimplify them now and what I'm about to say, but it's broadly true. The Auckland market's usually about 3 years ahead of most of the rest of the country. So when the Auckland market's going up, there is, if you imagine the market as 7 years where house prices are rising and 3 years where they're staying flat, very, very simple. That happens throughout the country, but it happens in Auckland ahead of where it happens in most of the regions. So Auckland goes up for 7 years and then it flattens off. Now, if you want to look at a good example of that, there's a really, really clear indicator of that in 2017 when the Auckland market, pretty much right on cue, and I predicted it at the time, flattened, and it stayed flat for about 3 years. And during that 3 year period, I was consistently predicting that the Auckland market would pick up in 2020, 21. I didn't know anything about COVID at this stage, and that it would go through another 6 or 7 year period where it would double. And it did pick up in 2021, although you could argue that some of that was fueled by what happened with COVID. What was different was that the rest of the country, which had continued to be reasonably strong from 2017 to 2020, should have stopped increasing in 2020 and started to flatten, and it didn't. Carried on into 2021, and I would argue that that was the result of some of the things that the Reserve Bank did around LVRs and dropping of interest rates and what have you. So if that all plays out as it should, regional markets should now be coming off the boil, and they should stay reasonably flattish for 2 or 3 years before they start increasing again. And if it plays out as it should, the Auckland market should be now in year two of a 6 or 7 year increasing cycle. So if the Auckland market, and keep in mind that when you look at that 7 year cycle, it's not a straight line. It's like the teeth of a serrated saw. It goes up and down all the time. And the reasons for that going up and down are sometimes just the vicissitudes of the market, and sometimes it's things that the government or the Reserve Bank might try to do. Now, I'm very much of the view that the Reserve Bank and the government cannot influence house prices sustainably, but they can impact on in the moment. What I mean by that is they can do something that stops house prices for a month or two, or impacts on house prices for a month or two, but then the market recovers and it continues to doing what it was always going to do. So my view is that the Auckland market is still very much in its boom cycle. That it might be being impacted at the moment by some of the things that the Reserve Bank's doing, but that it is stronger than the Reserve Bank, and that it will continue doing what you would have expected it to do over the next 4 or 5 years as it completes that 7 year cycle, but that the rest of the country arguably is in its flattening period and will stay there for 2 or 3 years. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out over the next 2 or 3 years.
Yeah, interesting thought. Actually, I hadn't seen that being described before. So yeah, good thought to have. I guess my basic economics understanding is supply and demand are very much influential on values, and we've seen of late how significant council and government are working to try and beef up the supply. How do you see that playing out as far as the Auckland market?
Quite differently to everybody else. I don't buy into the idea there's a shortage. And I'll tell you why, because that's a very extreme statement to make that makes people cough into their coffee at this point. So we've all bought into this mantra over the last couple of years or longer, actually, that there is a supply shortage, and that if only we resolve that's why house prices are going up, and if only we resolve that house prices would taper off. And what we normally do is we look at Christchurch as a template for that and say, well, look what happened after the earthquake. We destroyed all those homes in the red zone, and then we quickly built a whole lot more homes. And because we built those homes so quickly and so many new properties came on the market, house prices flattened, which is true. Problem we've got when you look at that at a national level is that the numbers don't stack up. Now, I'm going to put this in really simple terms. I don't want your viewers' eyes to glaze over, but it's important to understand what I tell them. There's something called the average household occupancy indicator, which is in the census. It comes out once every 5 years when Stats New Zealand does a census, and it's a measure that tells us how many people are in an average New Zealand home. So what it does is it takes the population of the country and it divides it by he said, forgetting what he was about to say, it takes the population of the country, divides it by the number of homes, and tells us what the average occupancy is. So if you reverse that equation and you know what the average occupancy is, you can work out how many homes were built over that period. Really simple. In 1986, we know that the average household occupancy, according to the census that year, was 3.29. Now, all that tells us is that an average New Zealand home had 3.29 people living in it. By 2013, that figure had dropped, not increased, but dropped. It had dropped to 2.86. That's not me making that up. That's based on the census itself. There is only two ways, Len, that number could drop. Only two. Either the population of the country dropped, and it didn't, or we built more houses than we needed. Simple. There is no other way of explaining that. So if you do the numbers, I won't bore you with them, but if you do the formulas and you actually work that backward and reverse engineer that number, it tells you that between 1986 and 2013, we built 200,000 more homes than we would have needed to just to stand still. Now, that's just bold numbers. That's not an opinion. That's just what the numbers tell you. So there's only two possibilities. One, we have no supply crisis, and that's a media and political invention. Or two, we do have a supply crisis caused by the fact that the houses we were building were not necessarily suited to the parts of the market where we required them. Now, it's possible that second one is true. So it's possible that we've been building higher valued houses at the top end of the market or the medium end of the market, and we haven't been building enough houses at the lower end of the market in the same way that we were doing in the decades prior to that. I certainly support that as a possibility. But despite that, I would argue that the supply crisis is either non-existent or has been heavily inflated as a cause beyond the actual reality of its impact on the market.
Again, a very interesting thought, mate. You're full of them.
Well, I think some people would say.
Yeah. I guess, what my mind thinks about when you drive around the suburbs at the moment, whether it be west, south, or East Auckland or wherever, there's so much construction going on, and which is a response
to this belief that we've got a shortage.
Yeah, and I'm just, I guess my next question for you was going to be, how do you see this flowing in? Then, if it's not quite the perceived shortage that we're made out to for it to be, how do you see this playing out? Are we going to have a glut?
So interestingly, it's a good question. So interestingly, my friend Tony Alexander, I see in one of his recent articles, he's come around to a more or less, not quite as extreme as me, but he's coming to increasingly to the same conclusion that this supply issue isn't as bad as it was made out to be. So in theory, one of two things. Firstly, you could, Economics 101, which Mina would probably adhere to because she the lecturer would be telling of us, is that if there was an oversupply, then house prices should taper off or in fact even reduce.
Yeah.
The problem with that as a theory is that if I look at the 4 decades over which we've had property cycles of the sort that I described before, that sort of broad doubling, if I go back to the 80s, very broad characterization, but relatively accurate. In the 80s, we had very high inflation, very high interest rates, very low immigration. In fact, we had a decline in immigration over that period of more Kiwis leaving than people coming in, and an economy that wasn't nearly as strong as it's been over the last 20 years. And we had a doubling of house prices over that decade. 10 years later, inflation had come down to some degree. Mortgage interest rates had dropped. We still had a net outflow of people, but it was getting a little bit better. And in that decade, house prices doubled. We go to the boom we've just been through. we had very low mortgage interest rates. We had very low inflation between that 1% and 3% band. We had massive immigration, and house prices doubled. So the point I'm making in all that is, somebody just turned their speaker on. Yeah. The point I'm making in all that is that the doubling of house prices has been to some degree condition agnostic. And that comes back to what I said before, which is and I've been doing this for a long time, and I've sort of honed my view more and more over the last 20 years, Len, in respect to the causes of house price inflation. And I've increasingly come to that view that the majority influencer, 80 to 90% of the influence is mortgage interest rates. And that all these other things, immigration, supply, all of these factors, property investors, all this other stuff that's blamed for house price increases is largely superfluous to the market.
Interesting. I'd be interested in your thoughts around some of the social impact of the intensifying the housing. I must admit I've got some concerns. I'd be interested to see what your thoughts are around how it's going to change our suburbs and how our living conditions and all that sort of thing. What's your thoughts?
Well, I can see both sides of this argument. So on the one hand, and keeping in mind that the Auckland Council spent, I think, 7 years developing a unitary plan which considered public opinion and took all of these factors into account and came up with something which, in theory, was the personification of the views of Aucklanders around what they wanted to have happen to their city, and it didn't necessarily please everybody, but it was a sort of a compromise that met the needs of views and versus intensification. And they had this mantra that they developed, which was developing up and out. So it was the idea that your city would continue to grow, but that you would also intensify in certain areas. The new changes which have come about in the last couple of months basically just throw all that out. Basically, throw out the baby with the bathwater, and have essentially said, if you want to build up to 3 stories and 3 dwellings on a site, you can do so without resource consent. And so essentially it's ignored all of that public consultation. Now, on the one hand, I understand why they've done that. It comes back to this mantra around developing as quickly as possible, and also feeding into that, I think, is a fairly large dollop of frustration at the intransigence of councils and the bloody-minded way in which they treat development. So I get why government and some of those who support this measure have said, hey, look, this is a good move because it gets past that roadblock created by councils. On the other hand, I think there are going to be some, as there is with most of these things, there will be some unintended consequences, not the least being the loss of heritage and culture, and also the impeding of people's habitation, their ability to enjoy where they live by having, huge monoliths built next to them that would never have happened had the rules not been changed. So while I understand the drive and the need for intensification, I think this measure is probably too blunt, and the effect of it will be that we will have some pretty ugly landscapes in 10 years' time where we look back and say, how on earth did we allow that to happen?
Yeah, I think I'd agree with you, Ashley, and yeah, I have some major concerns myself. So, okay, let's move it back a little bit to where we were earlier. There, we're trying to advise our clients on which way is best for them to come to. Well, I'm talking about buyers now. Come to purchase a property. Are you seeing it the way we see it? The people that can come to the market to buy in a cash unconditional scenario being a lot better off than the subject to finance or subject to other conditions going forward? What's your thoughts around that? Well,
that was certainly true. That was certainly true up until a couple of months ago. But as you say, our clearance rates are starting to come off a little bit now, which indicates that the market is tempering a little bit. So I suspect that while in any market the ability to move without conditions is obviously going to be advantageous in terms of negotiating a purchase, I think probably the strength of that now is maybe less than it might have been a couple of months back. Although having said that, the pace of purchasing in the previous market was so strong that you probably almost had to be in that position or you weren't going to be able to buy. So that's probably a counterpoint to what I'm saying. But look, in any market, whether you're an investor or an owner-occupier, the fewer conditions, the better, and none's best of all. So if you can, if you can be in a position to move as essentially a cash buyer without the normal requirements, all power to you. I would caveat that by saying that as a purchaser, obviously you should exercise caution and due diligence as much as you can, but that's going to be tempered by what else is going on in the market and how quickly that change is taking place.
Okay. Actually, let's go to the other side of the ledger and talk to our potential sellers that are listening in and going to be watching this. What advice would you give them as far as timing goes? Is there anything that you would be happy to share with them?
Yeah, a couple of things. So the problem with that, of course, is it's probably a bit too blunt of an instrument because people sell for different reasons. So if people are selling because they're relocating or downsizing or what have you, then the timing and imperatives on them are going to be different to somebody who's looking at taking their chance because the market's strong. So let's focus on that second group. Let's say it's somebody who's looking at the market right now and saying, hey, there's really good, strong prices. Maybe it's time for me to have a look to see whether I can extract some of the capital I've got from my home. Now, the problem with that is if you're buying and selling in the same location, then it's a net neutral position, because so let's say you're in Auckland and you're looking to buy and sell in broadly the same suburb or somewhere reasonably close, then yes, you're going to get a premium price for your property, but you're also going to pay a premium price for the next one that you buy if you're simply buying another home, unless you're downsizing. That changes that equation a little bit. So I would be, and of course the other thing at the moment is, and I'm hearing it increasingly, is people saying, oh well, I need to sell pretty quickly because house prices are going to drop soon. I'm very clearly in the view that house prices are not going to drop. They may taper off. House price growth may moderate a little bit over the next year or two in Auckland. I see nothing to suggest that house prices are going to drop. They're going to go down, and frankly, that's wishful thinking on behalf of those people. So if you're looking to take advantage of and want to extract capital from a property that you live in Auckland, and you're looking at moving to another location, particularly a location in regional New Zealand, which a lot of people are doing now, then that equation is I wouldn't say it's as good as it's going to get now, but it's in a pretty benevolent position for Aucklanders. If you're simply looking to extract capital in order to buy another property, then just be careful. And I say be careful because it would be one of the scariest things that could happen is having a great offer, selling your home, thinking, okay, I'll take this and go and buy another property, finding that there aren't the properties available that you thought that there were going to be, waiting 3 or 4 months and having property gone up by another 3 or 4% over that period of time. So, there's a little bit of a balancing act. I would recommend, and I'm a conservative, so just be clear, I'm very cautious of this stuff. I'd recommend that you knew what you were buying before you sold.
I think that's good advice as well, mate. Just turning our minds to investors at the moment, and I know with the new criteria around Brightline and also taking away their tax deductibility on interest and all that sort of thing has got some private investors very, very nervous about coming into the property market. Have you got any thoughts around all this and how that's going to play out? Because
yeah, I had the tale of two cities. In one city lives people like me who've been investors for a long time, who are seeing an erosion of the circumstances under which they originally purchased. So for those people, they're having the deductibility of interest taken away. They're having new rules put in place that weren't previously there. They're having an increase of a Brightline test from 2 years to 5 years to 10 years. And so for those people, the situation is deteriorating. For somebody who's not invested before and they're just starting, this is the new normal. So provided capital gain continues, and it will, even if the market goes up and down, the long-term trajectory will still be up. As long as capital gain continues over the next 10 years, then for a new investor, this is the new normal, and they won't know what they don't know. They want those things that they don't have. They never had. If you go back 20 or 30 years, you used to be able to claim 4% depreciation on the constructed part of a dwelling, which meant you bought a house. You could actually deduct for interest for tax purposes 4% of the value of the current value of the dwelling itself. And that's been gone for a long time. And anybody who entered the market over the last 10 years wouldn't even know what that was like. But for people that lost it, it was loss of a bonanza. Same situation prevails. It is what it is. So provided capital growth continues, I don't think these other things will have a long-term impact on investment in the market. Much as I hate the fact that they've gone.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I guess your previous association with the property investors, gives you very, very good authority to make comment around that. My thoughts or my concerns are if the private investors aren't there or in the numbers that they were, then we have to turn to public housing, don't we, to fill up the void. And I have some concerns about that. I'm not sure about yourself.
That won't happen. I'll tell you what will. You're quite right. And that's the idiocy, the absolute idiocy of current policy, which is there is a growing proportion of Kiwis that require rental housing. And it's not growing as a percentage, by the way. The percentage has actually stayed remarkably consistent for almost 100 years. It's about 35% of the population of the country, and that has stayed the same for a very long time, very, very similar for a very long time. But as the population grows, numerically, it's a bigger number of people, even though the percentage stays the same. So policies that deteriorate the appetite of private investors to invest in the market are foolhardy, because all they do is they transfer that responsibility from the private investor to the state. What will happen, and it will either happen in 2023 or 2026, is an incoming government will have to deal with this, and it will have to deal with it quickly. And you will see a very rapid reversal of these policies, and you'll see incentives put in place for investors in order to get people back into the market to fix the mess that's been created.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you. All right, well, let's wrap it up here, and really appreciate.
We've got someone who wants to ask a question. Right.
Okay, we've got a question. Somebody just wants to fire at you.
Is that me, Ra?
Yep.
Yes.
Oh, you actually probably just answered it, Ashley. My children are new first home buyers, investors, and their idea was to purchase a property which has got 2 homes on it, rent it out for 5 years, worked in the affordability, worked out with the profit on the property and what they could say they could pay $50,000 a year off it. But now they bought it 3 weeks, I think, before the changes. So that was the clangor. So obviously now they need to be looking, because of the bright line, at the affordability, because of the changes in the tax and the interest rates. And my question was, do you believe that if the right gets in next election, they will reinstate the deductibility, or is it all talk?
I hope so. Is probably the best answer I can give. I've heard varying things. On the one hand, there's a battle going on within the National Party at the moment over ascendancy of policy, and there are those who would share the views that you and I have got, which is that we should recognise this for the evil that it is and restore the situation that prevailed prior to the changes. There's another part of the party. Hopefully, this will all be resolved tomorrow, by the way. There's another part of the party that sees itself as Labour light and thinks these things are good, and will carry on the same stupidity if they're in a position where they're in any sort of influence. I think that they will reverse some, but not all. For example, I think the deductibility of interest will be restored simply because that's just economics 101. That's how a business works. So it's the situation at the moment where you're not able to claim interest as a tax deductible expense is beyond crazy. The bright line test is an interesting one because even at 5 years it was overkill. At 10 years it's absolutely bloody ridiculous. It should never have happened. However, it is what it is. The healthy home stuff will say, and some would argue that's not unreasonable. So some will go, some won't. But I'm looking forward to seeing some certainty around this stuff, because National are doing themselves no favours at the moment with respect to putting a line in the sand on some of this stuff.
I was involved initially in the setting up of the capital gains tax in Australia in 1985.
Sure.
And
your fault, really?
Pardon?
Your fault.
No. And the Tax Act just like tripled in size. It became so difficult because it obviously just wasn't on properties; it was on everything. Yeah. And I personally wouldn't feel hugely upset if they did bring in a capital gains tax and brought it down and said 20% is taxable, or even if they came back and they said the interest deductibility will allow you a deduction of 50%, recognizing that you're getting a 50% capital gain, as long as that interest was deductible at the end against the capital gains tax that you had to pay.
So I'm on record, Ro, I've got a view on this which is actually unpopular, but I'm on record as saying I actually support a capital gains tax, but it would need to be a low-level capital gains tax of perhaps 3.5%, 4%, and I would make it universal. I'd make it on everything, family, home, regardless. It wouldn't just be investment properties, and it would basically, and you'd also apply it to any other form of capital growth as well on other forms of asset. Now, the reason I say that is A, because we'd grizzle about it and we'd accept it, and that would be another form. But secondly, I did some numbers on it, and it would doing that would introduce about 3 times as much revenue as we would have got through just property investors. The property investment proposal that Labor introduced was purely about punishing investors.
Can I just say something else? I'm very concerned about this infill housing, and I live not very far from the big Mount Roskill development that's happening there. My issue is that initially it looks great, but the government has built right up to the boundaries of the small primary school there, but they're bringing in, you know, so many more families. And I just see that this rush of development seems to be for all first home buyers. Well, first home buyers become second home buyers, and then they want something bigger, you know, with a back garden, a little bit of place for the kids. And I just see that we're going to be swamped with these first home buyer properties. And what's going to happen then to them? Are they going to be empty? Are they going to become slums? Because, you know, so many have moved on. It is a worry. And the only way I can see that first home buyers are going to get into the market in terms of getting borrowings is that they say have to come up with 5%, and the government guarantees the 20%. And the moment the property increases above 20%, the government drops its guarantee.
Yep.
If that first home buyer falls over, the government buys the property, turns it into a state house, and gives them the opportunity to get back into it within 5 years. And that, I think, solves everything.
Have you been reading my articles or listening to something like that? Because that's pretty much exactly my view as well. I have exactly the same view.
Oh, good. I'm glad we think the same. No, I hadn't read that one.
Yeah, that would actually be a very effective tool. And the advantage of it, of course, too, is that the risks of the government would be minimal. They would hardly ever find themselves in a position where they actually had to act on that. So I think that would be, and in fact, if I had my way, government policy around housing would be focused around first-time buyers. First-time buyers would be the primary subject of that policy, with everything else being secondary to it. My reason for that is if you increase the number of people in your country that have got own their own home, a whole range of other social ills get solved.
Yeah, exactly.
But that's unlikely to happen with the current crowd, who I think would take us back to Leninist Russia, where the state owned most of them. But that's a topic for another day.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for your question. It was a great one. Hey, Ashley, there is a very long question in the chat box, and I'm going to simplify it very quickly.
Sure.
I think, you know, we've all been told that immigration was going to drop dramatically of late, but what we've got is 150,000 plus people that have now been virtually guaranteed residency, and a lot of those people are going to be in a position to purchase a home. Do you see that sort of substituting for that immigration to some degree, and also having an impact on the market, especially most of those people I assume would be in Auckland as well?
Yeah, so if I was to say yes to that, I'd be buying into the idea that immigration was a major driver of house price inflation. So there's 2 separate questions there. If you were asking me, will it impact on house price inflation, my answer would be yes, but not much. If the secondary question is, will that impact on the market in terms of putting pressure around the market overall throughout the country, not just Auckland? The answer is well, yes, because that's a lot of people all at the same time. And I know that seems counterintuitive, because people will say if there's pressure on, then surely that's going to push prices up. But as I said before, when I've looked at what's happened to the market over the last 40 years, immigration's been very low and very high. It's made very little difference to the behaviour of the market in the long run. So it might in the short term, but in the long run, the market will do what the market does.
Okay.
Which is not a good answer, by the way, but it's
almost fence sitting. Well, look, I really, really appreciate your time today, Ashley, and just love the fact that you don't sit on the fence too often, and you do make a real statement. And I think the people that have been listening in will appreciate it as much as I have. So on behalf of everyone, thank you. Really look forward to maybe having another chat at some time during next year, and we'll see how your forecasts play out. Huh? We could revisit it. But yeah,
look forward to it.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Ash.
Thanks, guys.
Thank
Ta-da.
you.